I'm Ben Roberts, Artistic Director at Brighton CCA, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this exhibition, Quiet Fire by Billie Zangewa. Billie was born in Malawi but grew up in Botswana before moving to South Africa, where she is currently based in Johannesburg. An artist of growing international standing, she has worked in the Tate, Pompidou and Smithsonian collections, among others, and in the last 2 years she has had a major museum touring show in the United States and a solo presentation at Musée des Beaux-Arts in Switzerland. This exhibition is Billie's first solo institutional show in the UK, which will travel from here in Brighton to John Hansard Gallery in Southampton and Tramway in Glasgow. Billie makes her works from cloth, collaging together fragments of silk she has collected, bought and found over the years. The works are both figurative and narrative based, telling the story of both her own life and of a more universal female experience. The exhibition as a whole is a capsule of Billie's work over the last 12 years. We have references to some of the lush early botanical works representing the landscapes of Botswana and her early life, alongside the domestic images for which she is perhaps most well known. Amongst these are other works detailing her social and political experiences of racism and prejudice, both from her life in South Africa and from travelling in the United States and Europe. Each work begins with the gathering of photographs and images as she begins to conceive of the final image she will make. From this early stage, for each work, Zangewa produces a drawing on thin newsprint paper, which forms the template for each work. Once the drawings are complete, they are used to cut and shape the fabrics, and so in the process of making the final work are destroyed. Within the exhibition, we have reproductions of 2 of these drawings, offering rarely seen insight into the artist's working processes. Throughout her work is a desire to address the ways in which black women are both seen and represented, creating a challenge to the reductive prejudice and objectification they often face. At the heart of the show is an epic new work commissioned for this exhibition titled Paradise Revisited, made in part as a response to Brighton's seaside location, but also as a turning towards a joy and positivity in the artist's life. The work depicts a time when Zangewa and her son were able to travel for a holiday in Europe for the first time after the pandemic restrictions had been lifted. It is her largest work to date, and in some ways a return to the botanical plants, colours and textures of her early work, but also a move towards landscapes and a more expansive view. While her new works such as this continue to contain figures, as she says, they are no longer the stars. Zangewa's work reminds us both of the power of small gestures, the activism of daily life, and a community of shared experiences. Accompanying the exhibition is a text commissioned from American author Disha Philo, responding to the works in the show, which is available online and in the gallery reading room. I hope you enjoy the exhibition.
So I want to ask you about this notion of the self-portrait in the first instance, and maybe how it relates to this image, Sweet Dreams, assuming that that is you in
Yes, that is the much younger version of me with more hair.
Yeah.
So self-portraiture for me, I think, initially it was a case of what was convenient. I had access to my image. But also I think that on a kind of subconscious socio-political level, I was reclaiming the power of my identity. Just because historically, and even today in many places, the female black African woman is an object to be used, to be objectified, desired, all of that. And we have no voice, no power. So silenced, right? So the invisible sector of our society. So I think on a subconscious level, I was saying this invisible sector of our society is a very powerful human being who can actually make people look at her life and say, oh, so this person does this and they exist and they do all these things. And also I think that's why in this particular era, I was making my figure larger than life because I wanted to be slightly threatening, just so you don't miss my presence. But having said that, and you can see from her gaze, she's challenging you, right? She's not looking away. She's kind of like, here I am, so, what have you got to say to me? But also, on a kind of more personal level, it was a yearning for the pastoral. So that's why I called it Sweet Dreams, because I feel like there's a part of me that's connected to my African ancestors that yearns for that time when we used to roam free, you know, before colonization and modernization. And I feel that it is in our genetic makeup that we have that yearning to just go back to the simplicity of days gone by.
Yeah, well, there's a simplicity, but also a mundanity, which is something we'll talk about in your work. And in a way, the kind of the radical gesture of thinking about the mundanity is something that deserves to be represented. I think is something that becomes quite acute in this work, Sweet Reprieve, which I believe is a portrait of your child. Again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it is. It's a portrait of my boy when he was a toddler. And I used to love to watch him sleep because it was the best time ever for me. Because I could be still. That's why it's called temporary reprieve, because the naps didn't last very long, but you know, in that moment you could, in a way you could appreciate, like you can appreciate your baby in that moment, because then you can look at them and go, oh my God, like what a beautiful, beautiful person you are. And also you can exhale because, you know, you're not trying to save them from killing themselves or something like that. But I think, you know, it's a work of love, this one for me. It's a tribute to how I feel about my boy. Like when I look at him, you know, everything bad goes away and it's just beautiful and perfect, and it's just this pure love that I feel.
I think we're going to hold on to that idea of love, but I want to ask you about this idea of process, because I think the two are so intertwined. And actually, Billie, I think you mentioned about kind of necessity being almost a kind of generator for a certain kind of creative innovation in the early part of your career, but you should talk more about how you began sourcing the kind of silk fabric that you often use in your work, because they're often scraps of fabrics, right, that have been disregarded, found at fabric stores, in which, yet say they've reached the end of a cycle of their life. So there is, I think, an aspect of your work that maybe less explicitly, but I think with a huge amount of intentionality, is talking about resource and talking about a certain kind of economy of materiality. So I think with that we could talk about that, but I also want to talk about the absences in the work. But first, a little bit about how you source the material.
So basically, in a way that I came to my technique was that I went out with an interior decorator friend, and she was collecting swatches for her project, and I just discovered silk and I collected little swatches. And then when I got home, I was like, wow, these could be so cool, and I could like collage something. So they were free, because in those days they used to give the swatches for free, and all I could afford was free. So that's actually what kind of sparked the interest in putting things together. But again, you know, and I think that whole kind of necessity thing that you were just talking about earlier is the reason why I will just use a piece of fabric with the, you know, with the uneven edges, because why would I want to get a perfect piece when I've already got this? Yeah. And then it started to speak to me, because then I started thinking about how, you know, as we go through life, we experience all sorts of things. You know, we get scars from, you know, from accidents, and they take away our baby perfection and their little memories. But also we experience, you know, different levels of trauma where something comes into our life, you know, some kind of intrusion that alters our innocence. In a way, yes, it kind of alters our innocence and leaves an internal scar. And I guess I'm really just expressing it externally. So I guess it's like personal psychology, but I also think of it as like a universal connection, because I feel that we all have some kind of scar, but then society has created shame around any kind of fracture or rupture, and we have to present ourselves as perfect. So we can't go out into the world and say, I'm Billie and I experience this terrible trauma and it haunts me every day of my life, whatever. Like, and so I'm kind of like saying, it's okay to be imperfect and perfect, because that is perfection.